Within the first eighth of a mile, the three little boys and their dog were following us. As we passed the corner where the shot-putter was, he waved at us. Brenda called, "Hi," and I smiled, which, as you may or may not know, makes one engaged in serious running feel inordinately silly. At the quarter-mile, the kids dropped off and retired to the grass. The dog turned and started the other way, and I had a tiny knife in my side. Still, I was abreast of Brenda, who, as we started on the second lap, called, "Hi," once again to the lucky shot-putter, who was reclining on the grass now, watching us, and rubbing his shot like a crystal ball. Ah, I thought, there's the sport. "How about us throwing the shot-put?" I panted. "After," she said, and I saw beads of sweat clinging to the last strands of hair that shagged off her ear. When we approached the half-mile, Brenda suddenly swerved off the track onto the grass and tumbled down. Her departure surprised me, and I was still running. "Hey, Bob Mathias," she called, "let's lie in the sun." But I acted as though I didn't hear her, and though my heart pounded in my throat and my mouth was dry as a drought, I made my legs move and swore I would not stop until I'd finished one more lap. As I passed the shot-putter for the third time, I called, "Hi." She was excited when I finally pulled up alongside of her. "You're good," she said. My hands were on my hips, and I was looking at the ground and sucking air. Rather, air was sucking me. I didn't have much to say about it. "Uh-huh," I breathed. "Let's do this every morning," she said. "We'll get up and have 2 grapefruit, and then you'll come out here and run. I'll time you. In 2 weeks, you'll break 4 minutes, won't you, sweetie? I'll get Ron's stopwatch." She was so excited. She'd slid over on the grass and was pushing my socks up against my wet ankles and calves. She bit my kneecap. "Okay," I said. "Then we'll go back and have a real breakfast." "Okay." "You drive back," she said, and suddenly she was up and running ahead of me, and then we were headed back in the car. And the next morning, my mouth still edgy from the grapefruit segments, we were at the track. We had Ron's stopwatch and a towel for me for when I was finished. "My legs are a little sore," I said. "Do some exercises," Brenda said. "I'll do them with you." She heaped the towel on the grass, and together we did deep knee bends and sit-ups and push-ups and some high knee raising in place. I felt overwhelmingly happy. "I'm just going to run a half today, Brent. We'll see what I do." And I heard Brenda click the watch. And then when I was on the far side of the track, the clouds trailing above me like my own white, fleecy tail, I saw that Brenda was on the ground, hugging her knees and alternately checking the watch and looking out at me. We were the only ones there, and it all reminded me of one of those scenes in racehorse movies where an old trainer like Walter Brennan and a young, handsome man clock the beautiful girl's horse in the early Kentucky morning to see if it really is the fastest 2-year-old alive. There were differences, all right. One being simply that at the quarter-mile, Brenda shouted out to me, "1 minute and 14 seconds!" But it was pleasant and exciting and clean. And when I was finished, Brenda was standing up and waiting for me. Instead of a tape to break, I had Brenda's sweet flesh to meet. And I did. And it was the first time she said that she loved me. I ran, every morning. And by the end of the week, I was running a 7:02 mile. And always at the end, there was a little click of the watch in Brenda's arms. At night, I would read in my pajamas, while Brenda, in her room, read, and we would wait for Ron to go to sleep. Some nights we had to wait longer than others, and I would hear the leaves swishing outside, for it had grown cooler at the end of August, and the air conditioning was turned off at night, and we were all allowed to open our windows. Finally, Ron would be ready for bed. He would stomp around his room, and then he would come to the door in his shorts and T-shirt and go into the bathroom where he would urinate loudly and brush his teeth. After he brushed his teeth, I would go in to brush mine. We would pass in the hall, and I would give him a hearty and sincere "Good night." Once in the bathroom, I would spend a moment admiring my tan in the mirror. Behind me, I could see Ron's jockstraps hanging out to dry on the hot and cold knobs of the shower. Nobody ever questioned their tastefulness as adornment, and after a few nights I didn't even notice them. While Ron brushed his teeth and I waited in my bed for my turn, I could hear the record player going in his room. Generally, after coming in from basketball, he would call Harriet, who was now only a few days away from us, and then would lock himself up with Sports Illustrated and Mantovani. However, when he emerged from his room for his evening toilet, it was not a Mantovani record I would hear playing, but something else, apparently what he'd once referred to as his Columbus record. I imagined that was what I heard, for I could not tell much from the last moments of sound. All I heard were bells moaning evenly and a soft, patriotic music behind them, and riding over it all a deep, kind of Edward R. Murrow gloomy voice. "And so, goodbye, Columbus," the voice intoned. "Goodbye, Columbus. Goodbye." Then there would be silence, and Ron would be back in his room. The light would switch off, and in only a few minutes I would hear him rumbling down into that exhilarating, restorative, vitamin-packed sleep that I imagined athletes to enjoy. One morning, near sneaking away time, I had a dream, and when I awakened from it, there was just enough dawn coming into the room for me to see the color of Brenda's hair. I touched her in her sleep, for the dream had unsettled me. It had taken place on a ship, an old sailing ship like those you see in pirate movies. With me on the ship was the little colored kid from the library. I was the captain and he my mate, and we were the only crew members. For a while it was a pleasant dream. We were anchored in the harbor of an island in the Pacific, and it was very sunny. Up on the beach there were beautiful bare-skinned negresses, and none of them moved. But suddenly we were moving, our ship, out of the harbor, and the negresses moved slowly down to the shore and began to throw leis at us and say, "Goodbye, Columbus. Goodbye, Columbus. Goodbye." And though we did not want to go, the little boy and I, the boat was moving and there was nothing we could do about it. And he shouted at me that it was my fault, and I shouted it was his for not having a library card. But we were wasting our breath, for we were further and further from the island, and soon the natives were nothing at all. Space was all out of proportion in the dream, and things were sized and squared in no way I'd ever seen before, and I think it was that, more than anything else, that steered me into consciousness. I did not want to leave Brenda's side that morning, and for a while I played with a little point at the nape of her neck, where she'd had her hair cut. I stayed longer than I should have, and when finally I returned to my room, I almost ran into Ron, who was preparing for his day at Potemkin kitchen and bathroom sinks. That morning was supposed to have been my last at the Potemkin house. However, when I began to throw my things into my bag late in the day, Brenda told me I could unpack. Somehow she'd managed to inveigle another week out of her parents, and I would be able to stay right through till Labor Day, when Ron would be married. Then, the following morning, Brenda would be off to school, and I would go back to work. So we would be with each other until the summer's last moment. This should have made me overjoyed, but as Brenda trotted back down the stairs to accompany her family to the airport, where they were to pick up Harriet, I was not joyful, but disturbed, as I had been more and more with the thought that when Brenda went back to Radcliffe, that would be the end for me. I was convinced that even Miss Winnie's stool was not high enough for me to see clear up to Boston. Nevertheless, I tossed my clothing back into the drawer and was able, finally, to tell myself that there'd been no hints of ending our affair from Brenda, and any suspicions I had, any uneasiness, was spawned in my own uncertain heart. Then I went into Ron's room to call my aunt. "Hello," she said. "Aunt Gladys," I said. "How are you?" "You're sick." "No, I'm having a fine time. I wanted to call you. I'm going to stay another week." "Why?" "I told you I'm having a good time. Mrs. Potemkin asked me to stay until Labor Day." "You've got clean underwear." "I'm washing it at night. I'm okay, Aunt Gladys." "By hand, you can't get it clean." "It's clean enough. Look, Aunt Gladys, I'm having a wonderful time." "Schmutz he lives in, and I shouldn't worry." "How's Uncle Max?" I asked. What should he be? Uncle Max is Uncle Max. You, I don't like the way your voice sounds. Why? Do I sound like I've got on dirty underwear? Smart guy. Someday you'll learn. What? What do you mean, what? You'll find out. You'll stay there too long, you'll be too good for us. Never, sweetheart, I said. I'll see it, I'll believe it. Is it cool in Newark, Aunt Gladys? It's snowing, she said. Hasn't it been cool all week? You sit around all day, it's cool. For me, it's not February, believe me. Okay, Aunt Gladys, say hello to everybody. You got a letter from your mother? Good, I'll read it when I get home. You couldn't take a ride down, you'll read it? It'll wait. I'll drop them a note. Be a good girl, I said. What about your socks? I go barefoot. Goodbye, honey. And I hung up. Down in the kitchen, Carlotta was getting dinner ready. I was always amazed at how Carlotta's work never seemed to get in the way of her life. She made household chores seem like illustrative gestures of whatever it was she was singing, even if, as now, it was, I get a kick out of you. She moved from the oven to the automatic dishwasher. She pushed buttons, turned dials, peeked in the glass-doored oven, and from time to time picked a big black grape out of a bunch that lay on the sink. She chewed and chewed, humming all the time, and then, with a deliberated casualness, shot the skin and the pit directly into the garbage disposal unit. I said hello to her as I went out the back door, and though she did not return the greeting, I felt a kinship with one who, like me, had been partially wooed and won on Potemkin fruit. Out on the lawn, I shot baskets for a while. Then I picked up an iron and drove a cotton golf ball limply up into the sunlight. Then I kicked a soccer ball towards the oak tree. Then I tried shooting foul shots again. Nothing diverted me. I felt open-stomached, as though I hadn't eaten for months. And though I went back inside and came out with my own handful of grapes, the feeling continued. And I knew it had nothing to do with my caloric intake. It was only a rumor of the hollowness that would come when Brenda was away. The fact of her departure had, of course, been on my mind for a while, but overnight it had taken on a darker hue. Curiously, the darkness seemed to have something to do with Harriet, Ron's intended, and I thought for a time that it was simply the reality of Harriet's arrival that had dramatized the passing of time. We had been talking about it, and now, suddenly, it was here, just as Brenda's departure would be here before we knew it. But it was more than that. The union of Harriet and Ron reminded me that separation need not be a permanent state. People could marry each other, even if they were young, and yet Brenda and I had never mentioned marriage, except perhaps for that night at the pool when she'd said, "When you love me, everything will be all right." Well, I loved her, and she me, and things didn't seem all right at all. Or was I inventing troubles again? I supposed I should really have thought my lot improved considerably. Yet, there on the lawn, the August sky seemed too beautiful and temporary to bear, and I wanted Brenda to marry me. Marriage, though, was not what I proposed to her when she drove the car up the driveway, alone, some 15 minutes later. That proposal would have taken a kind of courage that I did not think I had. I did not feel myself prepared for any answer but hallelujah. Any other kind of yes wouldn't have satisfied me, and any kind of no, even one masked behind the words, "Let's wait, sweetheart," would have been my end. So I imagine that's why I proposed the surrogate, which turned out finally to be far more daring than I knew it to be at the time. "Harriet's plane is late, so I drove home," Brenda called. "Where's everyone else?" "They're going to wait for her and have dinner at the airport. I have to tell Carlotta." And she went inside. In a few minutes she appeared on the porch. She wore a yellow dress that cut a wide-bottomed U across her shoulders and neck and showed where the tanned flesh began above her breasts. On the lawn she stepped out of her heels and walked barefoot over to where I was sitting under the oak tree. "Women who wear high heels all the time get tipped ovaries," she said. "Who told you that?" "I don't remember. I like to think everything's ship-shape in there." Brenda, I want to ask you something. She yanked the blanket with a big O on it over to us and sat down. What? She said. I know this is out of the blue, though really it's not. I want you to buy a diaphragm, to go to a doctor and get one. She smiled. Don't worry, sweetie. We're careful. Everything is okay. But that's the safest. We're safe. It'd be a waste. But why take chances? But we aren't. How many things do you need? Honey, it isn't bulk I'm interested in. It's not even safety, I added. You just want me to own one, is that it? Like a walking stick or a pith helmet. Brenda, I want you to own one for the sake of pleasure. Pleasure? Whose? The doctor's? Mine, I said. She did not answer me, but rubbed her fingers along the ridge of her collarbone to wipe away the tiny globes of perspiration that had suddenly formed there. No, Neil, it's silly. Why? Why? It just is. You know why it's silly, Brenda, because I asked you to do it. That's sillier. If you asked me to buy a diaphragm, we'd have to go straight to the Yellow Pages and find a gynecologist open on Saturday afternoon. I would never ask you to do that, baby. It's the truth, I said, though I was smiling. It's the truth. It's not, she said, and got up and walked over to the basketball court, where she walked on the white lines that Mr. Potemkin had laid the day before. Come back here, I said. Neil, it's silly and I don't want to talk about it. Why are you being so selfish? Selfish? You're the one who's being selfish. It's your pleasure. That's right, my pleasure. Why not? Don't raise your voice. Carlotta. Then get the hell over here, I said. She walked over to me, leaving white footprints on the grass. I didn't think you were such a creature of the flesh, she said. Didn't you? I said. I'll tell you something that you ought to know. It's not even the pleasures of the flesh I'm talking about. Then, frankly, I don't know what you're talking about, why you're even bothering. Isn't what we use sufficient? I'm bothering just because I want you to go to a doctor and get a diaphragm. That's all. No explanation, just do it. Do it because I asked you to. You're not being reasonable. God damn it, Brenda. God damn it yourself, she said, and went up into the house. I closed my eyes and leaned back, and in 15 minutes, or maybe less, I heard somebody stroking at the cotton golf ball. She had changed into shorts and a blouse and was still barefoot. We didn't speak with each other, but I watched her bring the club back of her ear and then swing through, her chin tilted up with the line of flight a regular golf ball would have taken. That's 500 yards, I said. She didn't answer, but walked after the cotton ball and then readied for another swing. Brenda, please come here. She walked over, dragging the club over the grass. What? I don't want to argue with you. Nor I with you, she said. It was the first time. Was it such an awful thing for me to ask? She nodded. Bren, I know it was probably a surprise. It was for me, but we're not children. Neil, I just don't want to. It's not because you asked me to either. I don't know where you get that from. That's not it. Then why is it? Oh, everything. I just don't feel old enough for all that equipment. What does age have to do with it? I don't mean age. I just mean, well, me. I mean, it's so conscious a thing to do. Of course it's conscious. That's exactly it. Don't you see? It would change us. It would change me. Us, together. Neil, how do you think I'd feel lying to some doctor? You can go to Margaret Sanger in New York. They don't ask any questions. You've done this before? No, I said. I just know. I read Mary McCarthy. That's exactly right. That's just what I'd feel like. Somebody out of her. Don't be dramatic, I said. You're the one who's being dramatic. You think there would be something affairish about it then. Last summer I went with this whore who I sent out to buy... Oh, Brenda, you're a selfish, egotistical bitch. You're the one who's thinking about last summer, about an end for us. In fact, that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's right, I'm a bitch. I want this to end. That's why I asked you to stay another week. That's why I let you sleep with me in my own house. What's the matter with you? Why don't you and my mother take turns? One day she can plague me, the next you... Stop it. Go to hell, all of you, Brenda said, and now she was crying, and I knew when she ran off I would not see her, as I didn't, for the rest of the afternoon. Harriet Ehrlich impressed me as a young lady singularly unconscious of a motive in others or herself. All was surfaces, and she seemed a perfect match for Ron, and, too, for the Potemkins. Mrs. Potemkin, in fact, did just as Brenda prophesied. Harriet appeared, and Brenda's mother lifted one wing and pulled the girl in towards the warm under part of her body where Brenda herself would have liked to nestle. Harriet was built like Brenda, although a little chestier, and she nodded her head insistently whenever anyone spoke. Sometimes she would even say the last few words of your sentence with you, though that was infrequent. For the most part, she nodded and kept her hands folded. All evening, as the Potemkins planned where the newlyweds should live, what furniture they should buy, how soon they should have a baby, all through this I kept thinking that Harriet was wearing white gloves. But she wasn't. Brenda and I did not exchange a word or a glance. We sat, listening, Brenda somewhat more impatient than me. Near the end, Harriet began calling Mrs. Potemkin Mother, and once Mother Potemkin, and that was when Brenda went to sleep. I stayed behind, mesmerized almost by the dissection, analysis, reconsideration, and finally the embracing of the trivial. At last, Mr. and Mrs. Potemkin tumbled off to bed, and Julie, who had fallen asleep on her chair, was carried into her room by Ron. That left us, two non-Potemkins, together. Ron tells me you have a very interesting job. I work in the library. I've always liked reading. That'll be nice, married to Ron. Ron likes music. Yes, I said. What had I said? You must get first crack at the bestsellers, she said. Sometimes, I said. Well, she said, flapping her hands on her knees, I'm sure we'll all have a good time together. Ron and I hope you and Brenda will double with us soon. Not tonight. I smiled. Soon. Will you excuse me? Good night. I like Brenda very much. Thank you, I said as I started up the stairs. I knocked gently on Brenda's door. I'm sleeping. Can I come in? I asked. Her door opened an inch, and she said, Ron will be up soon. We'll leave the door open. I only want to talk. She let me in, and I sat in the chair that faced the bed. How do you like your sister-in-law? I've met her before. Brenda, you don't have to sound so damn terse. She didn't answer, and I just sat there yanking the string on the shade up and down. Are you still angry? I asked at last. Yes. Don't be, I said. You can forget about my suggestion. It's not worth it if this is what's going to happen. What did you expect to happen? Nothing. I didn't think it would be so horrendous. That's because you can't understand my side. Perhaps. No perhaps about it. Okay, I said, I just wish you'd realize what it is you're getting angry about. It's not my suggestion, Brenda. No? What is it? It's me. Oh, don't start that again, will you? I can't win no matter what I say. Yes, you can, I said. You have. I walked out of her room, closing the door behind me for the night. When I got downstairs the following morning, there was a great deal of activity. In the living room, I heard Mrs. Potemkin reading a list to Harriet, while Julie ran in and out of rooms in search of a skate key. Carlotta was vacuuming the carpet. Every appliance in the kitchen was bubbling, twisting, and shaking. Brenda greeted me with a perfectly pleasant smile, and in the dining room, where I walked to look out at the back lawn and the weather, she kissed me on the shoulder. Hello, she said. Hello. I have to go with Harriet this morning, Brenda told me, so we can't run, unless you want to go alone. No, I'll read or something. Where are you going? We're going to New York, shopping. She's going to buy a wedding dress for after the wedding, to go away in. What are you going to buy? A dress to be maid of honor in. If I go with Harriet, then I can go to Bergdorf's without all that Orbach's business with my mother. Get me something, will you? I said. Oh, Neil, are you going to bring that up again? I was only fooling. I wasn't even thinking about that. Then why did you say it? Oh, Jesus, I said, and went outside and drove my car down into Milburn Center, where I had some eggs and coffee. When I came back, Brenda was gone, and there were only Carlotta, Mrs. Potemkin, and myself in the house. I tried to stay out of whichever rooms they were in, but finally Mrs. Potemkin and I wound up sitting opposite each other in the TV room. She was checking off names on a long sheet of paper she held. Next to her on the table were 2 thin phone books, which she consulted from time to time. "No rest for the weary," she said to me. I smiled hugely, embracing the proverb as though Mrs. Potemkin had just then coined it. "Yes, of course," I said. "Would you like some help? Maybe I could help you check something." "Oh, no," she said with a little head-shaking dismissal. "It's for Hadassah." "Oh," I said. I sat and watched her until she asked, "Is your mother in Hadassah?" "I don't know if she is now. She was in Newark." "Was she an active member?" "I guess so. She was always planting trees in Israel for someone." "Really?" Mrs. Potemkin said. "What's her name?" "Esther Klugman. She's in Arizona now. Do they have Hadassah there?" "Wherever there are Jewish women." "Then I guess she is. She's with my father. They went there for their asthma. I'm staying with my aunt in Newark. She's not in Hadassah. My Aunt Sylvia is, though. Do you know her? Aaron Klugman and Sylvia? They belong to your club. They have a daughter, my cousin Doris." I couldn't stop myself. "They live in Livingston. Maybe it isn't Hadassah my Aunt Sylvia belongs to. I think it's some TB organization, or cancer. Muscular dystrophy, maybe. I know she's interested in some disease." "That's very nice," Mrs. Potemkin said. "Oh, yes. They do very good work." "I know." Mrs. Potemkin, I thought, had begun to warm to me. She let the purple eyes stop peering and just look out at the world for a while without judging. "Are you interested in B'nai B'rith?" she asked me. "Ron is joining, you know, as soon as he gets married." "I think I'll wait till then," I said. Petulantly, Mrs. Potemkin went back to her lists, and I realized it had been foolish of me to risk light-heartedness with her about Jewish affairs. "You're active in the temple, aren't you?" I asked with all the interest I could muster. "Yes," she said. "What temple do you belong to?" she asked in a moment. "We used to belong to Hudson Street Synagogue. Since my parents left, I haven't had much contact." I don't know whether Mrs. Potemkin caught a false tone in my voice. Personally, I thought I had managed my rueful confession pretty well, especially when I recalled the decade of paganism prior to my parents' departure. Regardless, Mrs. Potemkin asked immediately, and strategically, it seemed, "We're all going to temple Friday night. Why don't you come with us? I mean, are you Orthodox or conservative?" I considered. "Well, I haven't gone in a long time. I sort of switch." I smiled. "I'm just Jewish," I said, well-meaningly, but that, too, sent Mrs. Potemkin back to her Hadassah work. Desperately, I tried to think of something that would convince her I wasn't an infidel. Finally, I asked, "Do you know Martin Buber's work?" "Buber, she said, looking at her Hadassah list. "Is he Orthodox or conservative?" she asked. "He's a philosopher." "Is he Reformed?" she asked, piqued either at my evasiveness or at the possibility that Buber attended Friday night services without a hat, and Mrs. Buber had only one set of dishes in her kitchen. "Orthodox," I said faintly. "That's very nice," she said. "Yes." "Isn't Hudson Street Synagogue Orthodox?" she asked. "I don't know." "I thought you belonged." "I was bar mitzvahed there." "And you don't know that it's Orthodox?" "Yes, I do. It is." Then you must be. Oh, yes, I am, I said. What are you? I popped, gushing. Orthodox. My husband is conservative, which meant I took it that he didn't care. Brenda is nothing, as you probably know. Oh, I said. No, I didn't know that. She was the best Hebrew student I've ever seen, Mrs. Potemkin said. But then, of course, she got too big for her britches. Mrs. Potemkin looked at me, and I wondered whether courtesy demanded that I agree. Oh, I don't know, I said at last. I'd say Brenda is conservative, maybe a little reformed. The phone rang, rescuing me, and I spoke a silent Orthodox prayer to the Lord. Hello, Mrs. Potemkin said. No, I cannot. I have all the Hadassah calls to make. I acted as though I were listening to the birds outside, though the closed windows let no natural noises in. Have Ronald drive them up. But we can't wait, not if we want it on time. Mrs. Potemkin glanced up at me. Then she put one hand over the mouthpiece. Would you ride down to Newark for me? I stood. Yes, surely. Dear, she said back into the phone, Neil will come for it. No, Neil, Brenda's friend. Yes. Goodbye. Mr. Potemkin has some silver patterns I have to see. Would you drive down to his place and pick them up? Of course. Do you know where the shop is? Yes. Here, she said, handing a key ring to me. Take the Volkswagen. My car's right outside. Take these, she said. Potemkin Kitchen and Bathroom Sinks was in the heart of the Negro section of Newark. Years ago, at the time of the Great Immigration, it had been the Jewish section, and still one could see the little fish stores, the kosher delicatessens, the Turkish baths, where my grandparents had shopped and bathed at the beginning of the century. Even the smells had lingered, whitefish, corned beef, sour tomatoes. But now, on top of these, was the grander, greasier smell of auto-wrecking shops, the sour stink of a brewery, the burning odor from a leather factory. And on the streets, instead of Yiddish, one heard the shouts of Negro children playing at Willie Mays with a broom handle and half a rubber ball. The neighborhood had changed. The old Jews, like my grandparents, had struggled and died, and their offspring had struggled and prospered and moved further and further west, towards the edge of Newark, then out of it and up the slope of the Orange Mountains until they had reached the crest and started down the other side, pouring into Gentile territory as the Scotch-Irish had poured through the Cumberland Gap. Now, in fact, the Negroes were making the same migration, following the steps of the Jews, and those who remained in the Third Ward lived the most squalid of lives and dreamed in their fetid mattresses of the piney smell of Georgia nights. I wondered, for an instant only, if I would see the colored kid from the library on the streets here. I didn't, of course, though I was sure he lived in one of the scabby, peeling buildings out of which dogs, children, and aproned women moved continually. On the top floors, windows were open, and the very old, who could no longer creak down the long stairs to the street, sat where they had been put, in the screenless windows, their elbows resting on fluffless pillows and their heads tipping forward on their necks, watching the push of the young and the pregnant and the unemployed. Who would come after the Negroes? Who was left? No one, I thought. And someday these streets, where my grandmother drank hot tea from an old Yarzeit glass, would be empty, and we would all of us have moved to the crest of the Orange Mountains. And wouldn't the dead stop kicking at the slats in their coffins then? I pulled the Volkswagen up in front of a huge garage door that said across the front of it, Potemkin Kitchen and Bathroom Sinks, any size, any shape. Inside, I could see a glass-enclosed office. It was in the center of an immense warehouse. 2 trucks were being loaded in the rear, and Mr. Potemkin, when I saw him, had a cigar in his mouth and was shouting at someone. It was Ron, who was wearing a white T-shirt that said Ohio State Athletic Association across the front. Though he was taller than Mr. Potemkin and almost as stout, his hands hung weakly at his sides like a small boy's. Mr. Potemkin's cigar locomoted in his mouth. 6 Negroes were loading one of the trucks feverishly, tossing, my stomach dropped, sink bowls at one another. Ron left Mr. Potemkin's side and went back to directing the men. He thrashed his arms about a good deal, and though on the whole he seemed rather confused, he didn't appear to be at all concerned about anybody dropping a sink. Suddenly I could see myself directing the Negroes. I would have an ulcer in an hour. I could almost hear the enamel surfaces shattering on the floor, and I could hear myself, "Watch it, you guys. Be careful, will you? Whoops! Oh, please be... Watch it! Watch... Oh!" Suppose Mr. Potemkin should come up to me and say, "Okay, boy, you want to marry my daughter? Let's see what you can do." Well, he would see. In a moment, that floor would be a shattered mosaic, a crunchy path of enamel. "Klugman, what kind of worker are you? You work like you eat." That's right, I'm a sparrow. Let me go." "Don't you even know how to load and unload?" "Mr. Potemkin, even breathing gives me trouble. Sleep tires me out. Let me go, let me go." Mr. Potemkin was headed back to the fishbowl to answer a ringing phone, and I wrenched myself free of my reverie and headed towards the office, too. When I entered, Mr. Potemkin looked up from the phone with his eyes. The sticky cigar was in his free hand. He moved it at me, a greeting. From outside, I heard Ron call in a high voice, "You can't all go to lunch at the same time? We haven't got all day." "Sit down," Mr. Potemkin shot at me, though when he went back to his conversation, I saw there was only one chair in the office, his. People did not sit at Potemkin's sink. Here you earned your money the hard way, standing up. I busied myself looking at the several calendars that hung from filing cabinets. They showed illustrations of women so dreamy, so fantastically thighed and uddered, that one could not think of them as pornographic. The artist who had drawn the calendar girls for Lewis Construction Company and Earl's Truck and Auto Repair and Grossman and Son Paper Box had been painting some third sex I had never seen. Sure, Mr. Potemkin said into the phone. "Tomorrow. Don't tell me tomorrow. Tomorrow the world could blow up." At the other end, someone spoke. Who was it? Lewis from the construction company? Earl from truck repair? "I'm running a business, Grossman, not a charity." So it was Grossman being browbeaten at the other end. "Shit on that," Mr. Potemkin said. "You're not the only one in town, my good friend." And he winked at me. Aha! A conspiracy against Grossman, me and Mr. Potemkin. I smiled as collusively as I knew how. "All right, then, we're here till 5, no later." He wrote something on a piece of paper. It was only a big X. "My kid'll be here," he said. "Yeah, he's in the business." Whatever Grossman said on the other end, it made Mr. Potemkin laugh. Mr. Potemkin hung up without a goodbye. He looked out the back to see how Ron was doing. 4 years in college, he can't unload a truck. I didn't know what to say, but finally chose the truth. I guess I couldn't either. "You could learn. What am I, a genius? I learned. Hard work never killed anybody." To that I agreed. Mr. Potemkin looked at his cigar. "A man works hard, he's got something. You don't get anywhere sitting on your behind, you know. The biggest men in the country worked hard, believe me, even Rockefeller. Success don't come easy." He did not say this so much as he mused it out while he surveyed his dominion. He was not a man enamored of words, and I had the feeling that what had tempted him into this barrage of universals was probably the combination of Ron's performance and my presence, me, the outsider who might one day be an insider. But did Mr. Potemkin even consider that possibility? I did not know. I only knew that these few words he did speak could hardly transmit all the satisfaction and surprise he felt about the life he had managed to build for himself and his family. He looked out at Ron again. "Look at him. If he played basketball like that, they'd throw him the hell off the court. But he was smiling when he said it. He walked over to the door. "Ronald, let them go to lunch." Ron shouted back, "I thought I'd let some go now and some later." "Why?" "Then somebody will always be—" "No fancy deals here," Mr. Potemkin shouted. "We all go to lunch at once." Ron turned back. "All right, boys, lunch." His father smiled at me. "Smart boy, huh?" He tapped his head. "That took brains, huh? He ain't got the stomach for business. He's an idealist." And then I think Mr. Potemkin suddenly realized who I was, and eagerly corrected himself so as not to offend. "That's all right, if you're a school teacher or, like you, a student or something like that. Here you need a little of the ganef in you. You know what that means, ganef?" "Thief," I said. "You know more than my own kids. They're goyim, my kids. That's how much they understand." He watched the Negro loading gang walk past the office and shouted out to them, "You guys know how long an hour is? All right, you'll be back in an hour." Ron came into the office and, of course, shook my hand. "Do you have that stuff for Mrs. Potemkin?" I asked. "Ronald, get him the silver patterns." Ron turned away, and Mr. Potemkin said, "When I got married, we had forks and knives from the 5 and 10. This kid needs gold to eat off." But there was no anger. Far from it.